Steel screamed against steel as a motorcycle folded into the guardrail at 80 miles an hour. The rider flew. He hit the asphalt and rolled, and then he stopped moving. Blood pooled under his gray beard. A trucker slammed his brakes and ran, phone in his shaking hand. By the time the ambulance found him on that dark stretch of road, half his ribs were broken and his lungs were filling with blood. The doctors took one look and shook their heads. This man would not see morning. Nobody knew his name. No wallet, no family, no one to call. Just an old man in a leather vest, dying alone under fluorescent lights. Except a young nurse named Delia Faye Rourke pulled a chair to his bed and refused to let go of his hand. Why would that choice bring 2,000 strangers to her door? Stay with me here. Cedar Hollow County Hospital sat at the far edge of a small Montana town, right where the flat land gave up and the mountains started. It was not a big place. 12 beds, one doctor on call after dark, and most nights on the graveyard shift, one nurse working the whole floor by herself. That nurse was Delia Faye Rourke, 31 years old. She'd grown up 2 towns over, gone to nursing school on a loan she was still paying back, and come home because home was where her mother needed looking after. Nobody would have called her remarkable. She kept her hair pulled back. She wore the same 3 pairs of scrubs on rotation. She drove a truck with 190,000 miles on it and a heater that only worked if you hit the dash just right. But here's the thing about Delia. In a hospital, you learn quick who the real ones are. And the real ones aren't the loud ones. They're the ones who show up, every shift, who remember which patient is scared of needles and which old woman likes her blanket folded down at the corner. Delia was one of those. She'd held the hands of dying strangers before. It was part of the job out here, where families lived far and roads were long and sometimes a person just ran out of time before their people could reach them. The other nurses noticed it about her. There was a saying on that floor, half a joke and half not. If it's your last night, you want Rourke, because Rourke stays. She didn't punch out at 7 if a patient was frightened. She'd learned that a long time ago and never once questioned it, and it had cost her 100 hours of sleep she never got back. She'd have told you every one of those hours was worth it. The night it happened, she was 3 hours into a 12-hour shift. Slow night. A kid with a broken wrist. An old rancher with chest pains that turned out to be heartburn. She was refilling the coffee pot in the break room when she heard the ambulance bay doors bang open and the paramedics start shouting. She dropped the pot and ran. They wheeled him in fast. A big man. Older, maybe 70. Gray beard soaked dark red. A leather vest cut over his shoulders, road-worn, cracked and faded from years of sun and wind. His boots were scuffed down to nothing. And his hands. Delia noticed his hands right away, the way a nurse does. Huge hands, scarred across the knuckles. The hands of a man who had worked hard and fought hard his whole life. The on-call doctor was a young man named Ellison, barely 2 years out of residency, and his face told the whole story the second he pulled back the blanket. Internal bleeding, crushed ribs, a punctured lung. Out here, hours from a trauma center, with a helicopter grounded by weather, there was nothing anybody could do but keep him comfortable. "Do we have a name?" Delia asked. The paramedic shook his head. "No ID, no phone, no plates we could trace yet. Trucker found him, said the bike was in pieces. We've got nothing." So they gave him a number. That's how it works when a person comes in with no name. He becomes a number on a whiteboard. And Delia stood there looking at that number, and she looked at the old man's face, gone gray now, his breath coming in wet shallow pulls, and something in her just refused it. Dr. Ellison pulled her aside and kept his voice low. "I'll be honest with you, he's not going to make it to morning. His body's shutting down. Best we can do is keep the pain off him and let him go easy." He rubbed the back of his neck. He looked tired and young and out of his depth. "I've got the rancher to discharge and paperwork stacked up. Can you sit with him? So he's not. He didn't finish it. He didn't have to. So he's not alone, Delia said. Ellison nodded, and he went back to his paperwork, and that was the last anybody official thought about the old man in bed 4 for a good long while. Now, Delia could have set him up on the monitors and checked in every 20 minutes like the rules allowed. Nobody would have blamed her. She had a whole floor, charts to fill and meds to count, and 100 small tasks that were technically more important than sitting with a man who was going to die no matter what she did. Instead, she pulled a chair to the side of his bed, a hard plastic chair, the kind that hurts your back after 10 minutes, and she sat down in it, and she reached out and took that big scarred hand in both of hers. It was cold. She wrapped her warm hands around it and held on. "All right," she said quietly. "I'm here. You're not by yourself. I've got you." The old man's eyes didn't open, but his fingers just barely twitched against hers, and Delia settled in because she decided, without making any speech about it even to herself, that this stranger was not going to leave the world with no one holding on to him. She had no idea who she was holding on to. She couldn't have known, and that not knowing is the whole heart of this story. The clock read 9 minutes past 11 when she started talking to him. She talked because she believed, the way a lot of nurses come to believe, that even at the very end, hearing is the last thing to go. That somewhere down in the dark, a dying person can still catch the sound of a human voice and know they're not falling alone. So she just talked about the weather coming down off the mountains, about her mother's stubborn old dog that had bitten the mailman twice and gotten away with it both times, about how she'd wanted to be a nurse since she was 9, since the year her father got sick, and a nurse named Ruth stayed late every single night and made a scared little girl feel like the world wasn't ending. "That's why I do this," she told the sleeping man. "Ruth, she's the reason I'm sitting in this ugly chair right now, so really you can blame her." She thought she saw the corner of his mouth move under that gray beard, just a flicker. Maybe she imagined it. She checked his pulse every little while because that was habit and because it gave her hand something to do. It was slowing. She knew what that meant. She'd sat at enough bedsides to read a body the way other people read a clock, but she didn't move her chair back an inch. If anything, she leaned in closer. Around 1 in the morning, the storm hit for real, and the wind threw sleet against the windows, and the lights flickered once and held. Delia kept talking. She sang a little under her breath, an old hymn her mother used to sing because she'd run out of stories and the singing felt right. And then, somewhere near 2, the old man opened his eyes. It startled her. His eyes were pale blue, clouded, but they found her face and focused, fully awake, fully there, in a way that surprised her after everything the doctor had said. "You've been here the whole time," he said. His voice was a wreck, barely a whisper, wet and broken, but she heard it. "I have," she said, "and I'm not going anywhere. What's your name, honey? Can you tell me your name?" He was quiet a moment, gathering himself for the effort of the words. "Gus," he said, "Kessler, but folks call me Preacher." "Preacher," she repeated, and she smiled at him. "That's a good name. You a preaching man, Gus." A sound came out of him that might have been a laugh, and it turned into a cough that bent him and brought fresh blood to his lips, and she wiped it away gentle and shushed him and told him to save his strength. But he shook his head. He had something he wanted to say, and he was not going to let it go unsaid. "My whole life," he whispered, "I had a lot of people around me, a lot." His pale eyes drifted to the dark window, but at the end, funny thing. "It's a stranger holds your hand." He looked back at her. "What's your name?" "Delia." "Delia." He said it slow, like he was setting it somewhere safe. "You didn't have to do this." "I know," she said. "I wanted to." His hand tightened on hers, more strength in it than she'd have believed, and his eyes shone wet in the low light. He looked at her a long moment, like he was trying to memorize a face he'd only just met. "You got people, Delia?" he asked. "Somebody sits with you when it's your turn." The question caught her off guard. "My mother," she said finally. "That's about it." He nodded slow, like that told him something. "Not enough," he said. "One's not enough. A person ought to have more than that." He closed his eyes a second. "You will trust me on that." "You will." She thought it was the fever talking. She patted his hand and told him to rest. It was right about then that Chaplain Morris came through on his rounds. Cedar Hollow shared a chaplain with 2 other little hospitals, and he only came around the graveyard hours a couple nights a week. It was pure chance he was there at all. He stopped in the doorway when he saw the 2 of them, and he asked quietly if the patient wanted a word of prayer. And Gus Kessler, with what was very close to the last real strength in his body, lifted his head off that pillow and looked at the chaplain and said something neither Delia nor Morris understood the size of. Not then. "Tell my brothers," Gus said. "When they come, tell them who stayed, tell them this nurse. She's the one held my hand. You tell every last one of them her name." He squeezed Delia's fingers. "Delia Rourke." The chaplain, thinking it was the wandering of a dying mind, nodded kindly and wrote the name in the little notebook he carried, more to comfort the man than anything. Then Gus caught his sleeve and there was iron in the grip. "Morris, listen to me, they'll come. You won't have to find them, just be ready when they do." And the old chaplain, not understanding, said he would, and he said a prayer over them both, and then he moved on. Delia stayed. She held on. And a little before dawn, as the sky over the mountains was just going from black to a bruised gray, Gus Preacher Kessler let out one long, slow breath and did not take another. His hand went slack in hers. She sat with him a while longer. She didn't rush it. She smoothed the blanket over his chest and brushed the gray hair back off his forehead, and she said, soft, "You weren't alone, Gus. You hear me? You weren't alone." Then she stood up and her back ached and her eyes were wet, and she went and did what nurses do. She notified the doctor. She filled out the time of death. She helped ready him with a care most people never get to see. And then the sun came up and her shift was ending and she thought it was over. That's the thing. She truly thought that was the end of it. One more stranger she'd held onto through the dark. One more name she'd carry a while and then let the years fold away. She poured herself a cup of that coffee she'd abandoned 6 hours before, cold now, and drank it anyway, standing at the window, watching the light come up pink and quiet over the wet parking lot. The storm had passed. It was going to be a clear day. She rinsed her cup. She got her coat. She was tired all the way down to her bones, the good kind of tired, thinking about nothing more than her bed. It was an ordinary morning, the most ordinary morning in the world. And then she heard it. At first she thought it was thunder, a low rumble way off rolling in from the direction of the highway. She glanced at the window, half expecting the storm circling back, but the sky was clear. The sound got louder, and it didn't roll and fade the way thunder does. It built, steady, deep. A growl she felt in the glass under her fingers before she understood it in her ears. It kept climbing until the whole building seemed to hum with it, until the water in the coffee pot trembled in little rings. It wasn't thunder. It was engines, hundreds of engines, and it was coming straight for the hospital. Delia went to the front and looked out through the glass doors, and what she saw stopped her cold. Motorcycles, coming up the county road in a column that had no end. 2 by 2, headlights on in the morning light. A river of chrome and black leather pouring toward the little hospital. And it wasn't slowing. Bike after bike after bike turned into the lot, and still more were coming over the rise, until the lot was full and they were parking along the road, along the ditches, in the field across the way. The rumble became a roar that rattled the doors on their hinges. Later they'd count it, near as anyone could. More than 2,000 riders. The day shift charge nurse came up beside her, white as paper. The administrator, a nervous man named Petrakis who just arrived, pushed out into the lobby with his tie half done and his face already sweating. "What is this?" he kept saying. "Who called them? Somebody call the sheriff. Call the sheriff right now." The two security guards came up from the basement, both young, both looking at that ocean of leather through the glass like men who just realized how little a uniform weighs. Petrakis was pacing now, punching numbers into his phone and getting them wrong and starting over. Because here's what happens to a story at a moment like this. It changes. It stops being one quiet nurse and one dying man in a dark room. All of a sudden it's 2,000 strangers in leather rolling up to a 12-bed county hospital, and nobody knows why, and everyone is afraid. The administrator was thinking lawsuit. He was thinking riot. He was thinking of the 12 patients upstairs, and how fast this could go wrong. "Lock the doors," Petrakis said. "Lock them now." "You lock those doors," the charge nurse said quietly, "and you've got 2,000 of them and a sheet of glass between. You want that. Leave it be." Petrakis stared at her and he didn't lock the doors, but only because his hands were shaking too bad to decide anything at all. "If any of this is landing for you the way it landed for me, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because stories like this one, the real ones, are the whole reason this channel exists. All right, back to that parking lot. The engines cut off, all of them. Not at once, but in a wave front to back until the roar dropped away to nothing, and the silence that came after was somehow louder than the noise had been. 2,000 people, and you could have heard a coin drop. Then they got off their bikes, every one of them, and they didn't rush the doors. They didn't shout. They lined up. Quiet and orderly in rows filling the lot, all of them facing the front entrance. Big men and small ones. Old riders with white beards and young ones barely out of their teens. Women among them too, standing just as tall. And on the back of every single vest was the same patch, the same colors. The top rocker with the name of one of the oldest, most feared motorcycle clubs in the entire country, a name that even Petrakis recognized, a name that made the blood drain right out of his face. Delia read that patch, and her mind went straight back to a cracked old leather vest cut over a pair of broken shoulders, and a big scarred hand going slack in hers, and a whisper in the dark. "Tell my brothers, when they come." She whispered it out loud without meaning to. "Gus." Petrakis grabbed her arm. "Do you know what this is about, Rourke? Do you know these people?" "No," she said, and it was the truth. She didn't know a single one of them, but she was starting to understand that they knew her, because that's who Gus Kessler had been. The quiet old man with no ID and no family anybody could find. He hadn't been nobody. He'd worn the top rocker. Which, if you don't know the world, means he was among the very highest of them. A founding kind of figure. A man they called preacher not as a joke, but because for 40 years he'd been the one who spoke over their dead, who married them and buried them, who held the whole brotherhood together through wars and prison and loss. There were men in that lot who owed him their lives, straight up, and men he'd pulled off the wrong road with his own hand, and men whose fathers had ridden with him before they were born. He'd ridden out alone that week. That was his way, near the end. He'd told a few of them he wanted to see the high country one more time before the snow came, and he'd waved off the ones who tried to come along, the way he always did. A wet road and a guardrail had taken him on a stretch of Montana highway with no one to know his face. But the second word went out that preacher had gone down at a little county hospital, they came. They dropped everything and rode through the dark from 4 states, and they came. The doors opened. Petrakis had his hand up like he might stop the whole ocean with his palm. But the man who came through wasn't looking for a fight. He was maybe 60, broad as a door frame, gray hair to his shoulders, and on the front of his vest was the flash that marked him as the national president of the whole club. His eyes were red. He'd been crying, and he didn't care who saw. He stopped in the middle of the lobby and he looked at Petrakis, and at the day nurse, and then he looked at Delia in her tired, wrinkled scrubs, and something crossed his face. He reached into his vest and pulled out a slip of paper, and he read from it, though his voice caught. "I'm looking," he said, "for a nurse named Delia Rourke." The whole lobby went still. Petrakis started to say something about calling the authorities, and the big man raised one hand, not a threat, just weary, and Petrakis went quiet. "Chaplain called us," the president said. "Man named Morris, found our number through a brother in Billings, told us Gus was gone." His jaw worked. "And he told us Gus had a message. Last thing he said, that there was a nurse stayed with him all night so he wouldn't go alone, held his hand till the end." His red eyes found Delia and locked on and would not let go. He wanted us to know her name. He wanted every one of us to know it. Delia's throat closed. She couldn't speak. She just lifted her hand a little and said, "That's me, I'm Delia." For a second, the big man didn't move. Then his whole face broke, the way a wall breaks, and this enormous, frightening stranger crossed the lobby and did not shake her hand. He took it, both of his around hers, gentle as anything, the exact way she had held Gus in the dark. And he bowed his head over her hand, and Delia felt something warm fall onto her knuckles, and she realized the man was crying onto her hand. "Thank you," he said. "It came out cracked in half. You don't know what you did. That man raised half of us. He buried the other half's brothers with his own hands." He lifted his head. "And we weren't there, we didn't even know. He went down out here alone and none of us were there." His voice failed. He pressed her hand tighter. "But you were a stranger. You were." He straightened, wiped his face with the back of his hand, unashamed, and turned toward the glass doors and lifted his arm and made a small motion. And outside, 2,000 riders as one took off their hats. Then they came, not all at once, one at a time. The president walked Delia out through those doors and into the cold, clear morning and stood her at the top of the little concrete steps, and the line began. 2,000 of the toughest, hardest, most feared people in the country, and they filed past her one by one, and every single one stopped in front of her and took her hand or bowed their head or pressed their fist to their chest over the heart. Some couldn't speak. Some just looked at her with wet eyes and moved on. Some said, "Thank you, ma'am," in low, rough voices. One giant of a man with a shaved head and tattoos up his neck knelt down on the wet pavement in front of her and put his forehead against the back of her hand, and stayed there shaking for a long moment before the next one gently helped him up. An old woman with silver hair took Delia's face in both hands and kissed her forehead and said, "He married me and my Ray 40 years ago. He named our son. Bless you, girl. Bless you forever." A young man, couldn't have been more than 20, stopped in front of her and tried to speak and couldn't. He tried twice. Then he just said, "He found me in a jail cell. Everybody else quit on me. He didn't." And he pressed his fist to his chest and went on before he broke down entirely. It went on for 2 hours. 2 hours in the cold, and not one of them left before they'd stood in front of her. The sun came all the way up over the mountains while it happened, and lit up the chrome and the leather and the wet cheeks of some of the roughest men you ever saw. All of them come to say thank you to a county nurse who'd made $190 that shift for holding a stranger's hand. Petrakis stood in the doorway and didn't say one more word about the sheriff. Somewhere in the first hour he'd stopped being afraid, and somewhere in the second he'd taken off his own hat and held it against his chest without quite knowing when he'd done it. And Delia stood there and took every handshake and every bowed head, and somewhere in the second hour she stopped being able to hold back her own tears and she quit trying, because she understood something now, standing at the top of those steps. She understood what she'd been holding in the dark. Not a nobody, not a number on a whiteboard. She'd been holding a whole world in her two hands, a man who'd been father and priest and brother to every soul in that lot. And at the end, when all 2,000 of them were scattered and unknowing, she was the one who'd been given to him. A stranger, just like he said. When the last rider had passed, the president came back to her. He was holding something. Gus's vest, the cracked old leather one they'd cut off him in the ER, cleaned up now, folded careful. On the back, the top rocker, the colors he'd worn for 40 years. "We don't do this," he said quietly. "You have to understand, these colors. A man earns them with his life and they go in the ground with him, or they get retired in ceremony and no outsider ever touches them." He held it out to her. "But Gus gave you his last words, and that means as far as every one of us is concerned, you're the last thing he ever claimed as his own. So this is yours now, if you'll have it, not to wear, to keep. So you never forget that you're family. You've got 2,000 brothers and sisters now, in every state in this country, and there is not one place you could ever go that you'd be unprotected again." Delia took the vest. It was heavy in her arms. She held it against her chest the way you'd hold a child. "I only stayed with him," she said. "Anybody would have." The president shook his head slow. "No," he said. "They wouldn't, that's the whole thing, darlin', they wouldn't, but you did." They buried Gus Kessler a week later, and Delia rode in the front in a truck behind the hearse, with 2,000 motorcycles at her back stretched out for 4 miles down the highway, engines low, colors flying. The whole state pulled over to watch it pass. She stood at the graveside with the family that wasn't blood but was more than blood, and when old Morris read the final words, it was Delia they asked to lay the first handful of earth. She did it. And she said, quiet just for Gus, "You weren't alone, not then, not now." And 2,000 people heard her and 2,000 people wept. She went back to work the next week. Same 12 beds, same broken heater in the truck, same 3 pairs of scrubs. She didn't take a dime from anybody, though they offered, though a fund appeared out of nowhere that paid off her nursing loan and her mother's medical bills and the mortgage on the little house. And no matter how many times she asked, nobody would ever tell her which one of them had done it. That was the club's answer. That was how they loved. Every year after that, on the anniversary of the night Gus died, the rumble would come back up the county road. Not 2,000 of them. A dozen, maybe, riders passing through or making the trip on purpose. They'd stop at the little hospital and ask for Delia Rourke, and if she was on shift they'd sit with her a while, and if she wasn't they'd leave something at the door. A flower, a patch, a folded note, and they'd ride on. She kept the vest in a cedar chest at the foot of her bed, wrapped in cloth. And now and then, when a patient came in with no name and no family and no time left, Delia would think of it. And she would pull the hard plastic chair to the bedside, and she would take the cold hand in her 2 warm ones, and she would say the same thing she always said. The thing she'd learned was the only thing that ever really mattered in the whole wide world. "I'm here, you're not by yourself, I've got you." Because that's the truth Gus Kessler carried down a dark highway to a stranger, and it's the truth those 2,000 riders carried back up it in the morning. It isn't the muscle. It isn't the miles or the colors or the fear you put in people. In the end, when the light's going gray and the road runs out, the only thing that counts, the only thing anybody remembers, is who was willing to sit down in the ugly chair and hold on. A young nurse held a dying man's hand all night because it was the right thing to do and she expected nothing back. And the next morning, 2,000 souls rode through the dark to tell her that it mattered, that she mattered, that not one act of quiet mercy, given in a room where nobody's watching, ever truly goes unseen. Hold on to that one, and I'll see you on the next.